Good afternoon, and welcome to the Oramed webinar on the need for oral insulin in type 2 diabetes. At this time, all attendees are in a listen-only mode. A question and answer session will follow the formal presentations. If you'd like to submit a question, you may do so by using the Q&A text box at the bottom of the webcast player, or by emailing your questions to questions@lifesciadvisors.com. As a reminder, this call is being recorded and a replay will be made available on the Oramed website following the conclusion of the event. I'd now like to turn the call over to Michael Rabinovitz, Chief Commercial Officer of Oramed. Please go ahead, Michael.
Thank you, Tara. Again, hello, everyone. Again, I'm Mike Rabinovitz, Chief Commercial Officer of Oramed Pharmaceuticals. As brief background, I joined Oramed in August of this past year after 25 years at Merck, having served in leadership roles across marketing, business development, and finance. Now I'm very excited on behalf of Oramed to welcome you to our webcast on the need for oral insulin in type 2 diabetes. Please advance to the next slide. We have an exciting agenda, which I will briefly review before transitioning to Nadav Kadron, CEO of Oramed. Nadav will provide a brief overview of Oramed before handing it over to our featured speakers, starting with Dr. Ann Peters, who will speak on the unmet needs in type 2 diabetes, and next, Dr. Alexander Fleming, who will discuss the potential for ORMD 0801. After our keynote speakers, I will return to summarize new market research results. We will then move directly to the Q&A session. Next slide, please. We are very fortunate to have such exceptional speakers and leaders for today's event. While proper introductions would leave no room for their talks, I would like to highlight a few points. Dr. Peters is Professor of Clinical Medicine at the Keck School of Medicine of the University of Southern California. She runs diabetes centers in Beverly Hills and in underserved East Los Angeles. In addition to her clinical work, she has been a principal investigator on multiple grants, has written over 200 articles and 4 books, and has given over 500 lectures locally, nationally, and internationally. Dr. Peters also has been on multiple guideline writing committees for the treatment of both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Dr. Fleming, who is also an endocrinologist, is founder and executive chairman of Kinexum, a strategic advisory firm, and also the founder and president of the Kitalys Institute, a nonprofit working to advance public health. Following 4 years at the NIH, Dr. Fleming spent over a decade at the FDA, where he was responsible for several therapeutic areas, including diabetes, in which he oversaw several landmark approvals during his leadership. Dr. Fleming coined the term metabesity as a means of defining a target for coordinated multi-stakeholder action and advises several organizations given such expertise. We are honored to have both Dr. Peters and Dr. Fleming speak and address your questions today. Next slide, please. As one more piece of business, let me share our safe harbor language for your review. It is also available on our website, oramed.com. Without further delay, I am happy to introduce the Chief Executive Officer of Oramed, Nadav Kadron.
Thank you, Michael. It's a real pleasure being here. You know, when we founded the company in 2006, we had the vision of bringing oral insulin to the world. And while Oramed has a platform technology that can deliver peptides orally, oral insulin is being the flagship. And the reason we're doing this KOL event right now is because we are advancing very nicely with our phase 3 on the oral insulin. We're actually planning to complete randomization over the first and larger part of the phase 3 oral insulin trial at the end of the next month. So we'll be able to have a readout by the end of the year. So that's why we're focusing more and more on the commercial aspects, and Michael will also discuss at the end of this a little bit more about it. So just to give a brief background about Oramed before we jump to our KOL. So the company is a public company. We have a good cash position of about $174 million without any debt. And we have a lot of interesting things that are waiting for us on the pipeline. But just to start with the basic technology, if you can advance to the next slide. So what we do is we developed the method to overcome the obstacles to deliver peptides orally. So we have the issue of the degradation and we have the issue of the size. And by developing our own proprietary protease inhibitor, what we do is we put the API, whether it's the insulin or something else, in a softgel capsule. We enteric-coat it, we put an enhancer in it and the protease inhibitor, and that enables the API to go intact from the stomach into the portal vein It passes the stomach safely, and then it goes afterwards into the portal vein, and then it reaches the liver first. And I think we're going to talk a lot about the advantage specifically with oral insulin as having a first pass into the liver. We can advance to the next slide. So as I mentioned, this is a platform technology. So our lead product is the oral insulin, and the 2 phase 3s, one of them, which we should have the readout at the end of this year, is the larger one. But we're also working on oral insulin to treat NASH. We should have a readout of that on the 3rd quarter of this year. We're also working on oral GLP-1 and oral COVID-19 vaccine. With oral COVID-19 vaccine, which is supposed to be like one vaccine that should be good against the variants, we should have a readout next quarter from the clinical trials that's taking place in South Africa. So all in all, we're going to have a busy year. Next quarter readout from the COVID-19, the following quarter readout from the NASH trial, and then afterwards a readout from our first and largest phase 3. So it's going to be a very, very exciting year, and we're really looking forward for you being part of it and to have a flow of information and to update you as we're making more and more progress with making oral insulin and other medications oral into a reality. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Peters to take over the microphone so we can hear more from her directly.
All right, well, thank you very much, and thank you for that kind introduction. And I'm going to talk to you about the need for oral insulin in people with type 2 diabetes. And I think that most people, at least not people in the diabetes field, don't understand how hard it is to get patients to take injected insulin. And I'm going to talk about that. And there's a whole psychology behind this that I can't go into in great detail. But trust me, it's hard to get patients who need insulin injections to give insulin injections. Next slide. This is my disclosure slide of potential conflicts of interest. Next slide. So we know that we now have all these great tools for treating people with type 2 diabetes. And in the past 10 years, the number of treatments we've had have gone up and up and up. And we now have agents that can not only lower glucose levels, but lower risk of cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, heart failure. It's kind of revolutionized our treatments. And I do a lot of guideline writing, and it's become really hard to write guidelines because we now have agents that can do all sorts of things. But that doesn't take away from the fact that both type 2 diabetes is at a high prevalence and it's increasing. And I think it's going to show a real bump in terms of rates of diabetes after the pandemic, not necessarily because I think COVID causes type 2 diabetes, although it could, but I think the weight gain and inactivity that's occurred during the pandemic is also going to show an increase in the rates of type 2 diabetes. People with diabetes have a much higher rate of cardiovascular disease than people without diabetes. And we know that there's a significant mortality associated with this. Every 5 seconds, one adult dies from diabetes around the world. And to some degree, I think that undercounts the rates due to diabetes because often those patients are coded for dying from cardiovascular disease or heart failure when in fact they're dying because of diabetes, which is the underlying cause. Next slide. This shows basically what happens in the development of type 2 diabetes. So in a non-diabetic human, there's always an element of insulin resistance, but insulin production meets the need and glucose levels are normal. And frankly, that can even happen in very overweight people if they don't have the genetic risk for developing type 2 diabetes. But as type 2 diabetes begins, people have an increase in their insulin resistance. And that's largely matched by an increase in insulin production. So during that pre-diabetes phase, what you see is higher insulin levels and higher levels of insulin resistance. And if you actually put a continuous glucose monitor on people, which I'm going to talk about later, you see an increase in postprandial glucose levels because their insulin production can't keep up with the need when they eat higher carb meals. But when people develop type 2 diabetes, the insulin resistance is pretty much stable, but now insulin production falls. So people with type 2 diabetes all have insulin deficiency and insulin resistance. And so clinically, we have to treat both. Next slide. So what do the guidelines say? And as I said, I've been writing these guidelines for the past several years, so I know them inside and out. Next slide. Next, yes, perfect. So basically, I'm not going to ask you to memorize this, but I have. And it looks at the pharmacologic approach to treating hyperglycemia in adults. So the ADA is focused on hyperglycemia. If you look at the cardiology guidelines, they're not as focused on hyperglycemia, but they need to consider glycemia because we know that hyperglycemia increases the risk for both micro and macrovascular complications. So the guidelines now start with metformin and exercise, but they go into looking at people who have high risk for cardiovascular disease, existing cardiovascular disease, CKD, and those are on the left of this, where we basically talk about the use of GLP-1 receptor agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors. But if people don't have those high risk characteristics, we look to the right of this, where we're basically treating glycemia, and we're looking at all the treatments we have. Now, I believe that if we had oral insulin, it would be higher in this algorithm and would be in this algorithm. But next slide. When we talk about insulin, we talk about adding it at this end stage of all this. So first of all, it puts in the algorithms insulin in a bad place. It's like you failed everything else, so now we're adding an insulin. But if you think about what I said to begin with, insulin deficiency is always part of type 2 diabetes. So we need to think about it earlier, but we think about it later because it's hard to give people insulin. It's hard to get them to give insulin because it's a once-a-day injection, or maybe it's a 5-time-a-day injection. And for many people, it requires lifestyle change. They have to think about this more. They have to think about giving the shot and what the dose is and whether or not their blood sugar is going to go low. And it's a big process. But then if one shot a day doesn't work, we have to go to multiple daily injections. And I had 2 slides for this before, and now I'm only showing you one, because this is where clinicians just have so much trouble. Clinicians have a hard time, not just the patients having a hard time at the thought of giving insulin, because again, it's an injection and it's a complicated injection. And so it's hard. And I even sometimes find myself going, oh, I don't want to give you insulin. And that's a bad message, right? I don't want to say you're failing, your beta cells are dying, we've got to give you insulin. I want to say this is part and parcel of the disease state that is type 2 diabetes. Let me give this to you easier and earlier. Next slide. So why is this so hard? Well, next slide. We have had 100 years of using insulin and 100 years of advancing insulin therapy. But all this has done is change the way insulin's absorbed, right? So we give longer acting insulins and shorter acting insulins, and except for some brief forays into using inhaled insulin, which has had issues, you basically give insulin with an injection or with a pump, and all of this involves giving insulin from the outside in. So when you think about it, insulin's not supposed to be given into your skin. It's supposed to be secreted by your pancreas into your portal circulation, where it then affects the liver, is degraded by the liver, and then goes peripherally. So I tell patients that even though we can do a pretty good job with injected or infused insulin, I can't approximate what nature intended by giving insulin from the outside. Next slide. This is a slide looking at dogs, and I want to point out that I treat humans, and it's a very complicated study, but they basically gave insulin in these conscious dogs via their portal vein versus peripherally, and they basically show a much better effect on hepatic glucose production when you give insulin in the portal vein. And I've always wished we had a way to do this in an easy way. And I think it's something we need to all look at and figure out how to give insulin in the portal vein. But when you give it orally, you are giving it much more closely to the way the body's meant to secrete insulin, which is into the portal circulation, and approximate what this normal signaling pathway does. Next slide. So not surprisingly, people with type 2 diabetes on insulin don't reach their target. So if you're looking at a target of less than 7 or even less than 7.5%, most people, 2/3 of people are above their target. And this means that they are at risk for progression of diabetes complications, and that's absolutely what we want to prevent. And this actually is even more worrisome to me because complications occur over time, and we're seeing people at a younger and younger age develop diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and they will have a very long time under which to experience hyperglycemia and complications. Next slide. So my world in the past 10 years has changed dramatically because now we can do continuous glucose monitoring. But that also means we can now really see what dysglycemia looks like in actual patients. So basically, continuous glucose monitoring consists of a sensor that's inserted on the person. So it's a little patch someone wears, and that then delivers via Bluetooth a signal to a receiver, which can be a smartphone or just a reader. So we can continuously look at glucose levels, and patients can see their glucose levels, and then I can print it out and look retrospectively. And I'm just showing you what normal looks like. So normal glucose metabolism is amazing. You can see that green bar. Almost all of these glucose levels are in the normal range. There's a couple low, but that's often seen in normal people because they will flux down a bit. Blood glucose levels in hopefully me and you are never going above 140. So people really do have normal glucose levels. And I did this study that looks at normal glucose levels in non-diabetic humans, use CGM, and it was really amazing how normal is. So we're not joking when we say we want to get you to normal, and we want all the tools we have to get people to this. So I'm going to show you what I find in my patients when I put sensors on them. Next slide. So this is a patient who has an A1C of 8.1%. Now, this isn't an uncommon A1C, as I showed you, in people with type 2 diabetes. This is someone on all the other non-insulin treatments who just doesn't want insulin. If I could just give this person insulin, I would shift this whole thing down and they'd be in range, right? And okay, maybe they need to eat fewer carbs for breakfast, but you can see here, and just for a frame of reference, the left side of this graph is midnight, the middle is noon, and the right is midnight again. You can see that person spiking at 9 a.m., but all those glucose levels are above 180. So I know if I got this person on insulin, and I'm not even being, saying how to give it insulin, but oral insulin would certainly work, I think, based on what I'm learning. But an injection would work too, but this person won't give an injection, and they're going to be causing all sorts of damage over time if they keep their glucose levels this high. I'll show you another patient who doesn't think they need insulin. Next slide. This is 9.5. This is someone where their glucose levels are through the roof. I never understood how bad an A1C 9.5 was until I saw this. And so what we're learning is that people who are high, who have these higher A1Cs, are really out of control. Many of them, even if they're on insulin, aren't reaching target. And a lot of people don't want insulin because they don't want to give injections. So we're really finding that we have this incredible unmet need for oral insulin, both because people don't want to give insulin, and even when they take insulin, don't use it appropriately to get down to target because it's hard. So I think that this really shows what we're talking about when we talk about what we need to further improve diabetes care. Next slide. So in conclusion, as I said, we're not reaching targets. The current state of diabetes management is unacceptable. Insulin is critical for managing these patients. It's fundamental to the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes. And I, as a clinician, am really looking forward to having tools that make it easier for me to give insulin to patients who need insulin therapy. Thank you. And I get to introduce or reintroduce Dr. Fleming, who's a very good friend of mine, and I look forward to hearing his talk. So Zan, please give
Thanks
your talk.
so much, Anne, and I'm honored to be with you, one of the major KOLs in the field. and someone who I really enjoy working with. Not so good to follow you, but glad to be with you. So here are my disclosures, and because I have a firm that helps multiple companies, there are a few, but then we can go on to the next slide, which I want to drive home the point, the very important point that Anne makes, and I love her expression. We give insulin from the outside in. That's the fundamental problem. We need to give insulin from the inside out to achieve physiology. All this means is that under normal conditions, when you eat a meal, the insulin that is released from the pancreas goes right to the liver, and the liver is the key organ for regulating glucose metabolism. The hepatocytes can both take up glucose and put it out. That's the only organ that can do that. Now, the problem with diabetes, type 1 or type 2, next slide, is that you lose that some or all of the ability to secrete insulin from the pancreas. So as Anne said, we inject the insulin under the skin, but it does not get to the liver, where it is a significant problem, because without having an adequate exposure of insulin in the liver, it makes it much more difficult to control glucose levels without getting into trouble with hypoglycemia. The fact is, injected insulin therapy is the most dangerous drug that we use on an everyday basis. It has no room or no margin for error, particularly in people who are highly dependent on insulin. And that again is because they don't have the control of liver metabolism. And so the key value proposition, next slide, is that the oral insulin delivery starts to mirror the way insulin is secreted from the pancreas. In effect, it goes from the GI tract, where it is absorbed, into the portal vein, as Anne said, and then it gets to the liver before it goes out into the muscle or out into the peripheral circulation. So this, next slide, is the key value proposition. It can get improved blood glucose control without adding risk of hypoglycemia. And that's the problem that Anne deals with every day, and helping patients to avoid hypoglycemia, which in some cases can be serious enough to cause injury or even death. A related advantage is that because injected insulin that does not go to the liver has a greater potential for causing weight gain. And so, like the case for controlling glucose, there is going to be more physiologic control of weight by avoiding peripheral insulin exposure. And it's clear that being an oral therapy is a big advantage and attraction to patients. And certainly this could improve adherence to treatment and to reduce the inertia of patients going on to insulin treatment when they need it. So that's an important aspect too, but this product is not just a matter of convenience. I think the key value proposition is improving glycemic control, overall metabolic control, without significant risk of hypoglycemia. Next slide. So just want to review quickly the data that have led to the current phase 3 trial program. And it starts with a phase 2 study where we used continuous glucose monitoring that Ann has already described as the readout, because the treatment duration was shorter than would allow a hemoglobin A1C readout to be fully accurate. So this involved 180 patients over 33 US sites and 28 days of treatment. And there were 2 dose groups, but we're going to be looking at the pooled data. They were 16 and 24 milligram dose groups compared to placebo. The primary endpoint was the mean nighttime glucose levels, or the effect thereof. And then there were other secondary endpoints, and I'll show you the data in the next slide. So on the left panel, you can see that the primary endpoint, the nighttime CGM glucose mean % change and the absolute change were clinically meaningful and statistically significant, as was the median absolute change in CGM glucose. Exploratory endpoints included looking at the overall 24-hour glycemic control as reflected by CGM, and the fasting level, which is very important because that's where patients start the day. And if they don't start out well, the fasting glucose, then it's tough to catch up. And then the overall daytime glycemic control was highly statistically significant and clinically meaningful. Well, this supported going on to the phase 2b trial, and the next slide, which will show that this study involved almost 300 patients across over 30 US sites and 90 days of treatment and 7 different dose groups. You can see quite a number of different dose groups going up to quite remarkably high doses, which, as it turns out, are not needed. In this study, patients were allowed to be on other oral glucose lowering drugs. And here, the primary endpoint was the mean change in A1C, which is also the regulatory endpoint. So going on to the next slide, we see that in the 8 milligram dose groups, both once a day and twice a day, that would be morning and evening, and the single 8 milligram dose is given at bedtime, that you get highly significant changes in hemoglobin A1C. This is looking at the change from baseline. And it is curious that you do not see a clear dose response with much higher doses. I think there may be some explanations for that that we can consider in a moment. But the point is, we do see very meaningful glycemic control differences that are effected by these 2 8 milligram dose groups. And then going on to the next slide, we can look at the effect by baseline A1C, because as Ann pointed out, people at higher glycemic, at higher A1C levels are have got that much further to improve. And in this case, you can see the mean change from baseline at week 12 results in an even larger effect size in that subset of patients with an A1C greater than 9. Now, just as important, and again, the value proposition here is that these changes in glycemic control occurred without any increase in hypoglycemia. You will not see that with an injected insulin product. You will see some degree of increased hypoglycemia events. And so I think this study provides not only very compelling evidence of clinical effect, but it shows that the expected safety is confirmed, or at least supported in this phase 2b trial. And then we're now in phase 3 because of this trial and the discussions with FDA, my former division. Next slide. And what this phase 3 program consists of is 2 large trials. One is in patients with more advanced type 2 diabetes. These are patients on 2 or 3 oral glucose-lowering agents. And it involves nearly 700 patients. And as Nadav mentioned, we are getting close to completion of randomization. This involves a double-blind study with randomization to placebo, 8 milligrams alone or 8 milligrams twice a day. And as mentioned, patients may be on other glucose-lowering therapies. And so this will be a very important readout on a large population of patients who have more advanced type 2 diabetes. But the next slide depicts the other study, which is of patients with earlier type 2 diabetes. These are people, and they're harder to find, who are either not on treatment, they're just on so-called diet control, or on metformin alone. And this will allow confirmation of clinical efficacy, but it also could support the value of the product as being used earlier, even as a first-line treatment for type 2 diabetes. So these 2 studies are similar in, or they're identical in duration and the primary efficacy endpoints, but they're different in populations and they're complementary in that respect. And so I'm very excited about this program, what it can do for patients, how for the first time we can actually insulinize the liver and have some means of improving glycemic control without substantial risk of hypoglycemia. So I think that's all for me, and it's back to Michael.
Thanks, Dr. Fleming. You are also a very difficult act to follow. But so we've had really good clinical and scientific presentations and reviews concerning our oral insulin candidate. So it makes sense, especially in my role, to share with you some high-level results from a very recently completed research project we did with IQVIA, a well-known and industry leader in this field. Please, next slide. For this market research, 170 endocrinologists and primary care physicians in the US, UK, and EU4 were recruited to understand their perceptions, clinical preferences, and future willingness to prescribe products in development. Importantly, the sample size that we chose allows us to perform the significance and data analysis desired. Next slide. When asked in general about their willingness to prescribe oral insulin, the physicians in this study responded very favorably, with 76% responding that they definitely would or probably would prescribe if available. Further, after being shown a target product profile based on the phase 2b data for ORMD 0801, the response improved, only improved, with just 1% answering that they probably would not or definitely not prescribe, thereby delivering on the promise of oral insulin. Based on this research and previous research that yielded similar results, we feel that there is significant and broad interest and potential demand for our oral insulin candidate if approved. As you can imagine, we are very excited about the potential of our oral insulin candidate to improve the lives of patients with type 2 diabetes. I know we went over a lot of information quickly, so let me turn it over to the moderator to begin the Q&A so that you can have the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you, Michael. At this time, we'll be conducting our question and answer session with our speakers. As a reminder, if you would like to submit a question, you may do so by using the Q&A text box at the bottom of the webcast player or by emailing your questions to questions@lifesciadvisors.com. Please hold for a brief moment while we pull for questions. So our first question comes from Edward Nash from Canaccord. Edward, you may go ahead and unmute your line.
Hi, thank you very much, and appreciate the company going through this. This was really very helpful. I just wanted to ask the doctors, for those patients that are currently on insulin, it makes obvious sense that this would be, a perfect, easy transition for them, and the physicians that are treating them would do that very quickly. But as far as the patients that are earlier stage, say that are pre-diabetic, KOLs obviously tend to be much more informed and cutting edge. Do you think that the adoption rate for those patients by the physicians would be a bit slower just because they're just not used to using insulin in those patients early on? They would still stick with oral agents other than this insulin?
And that's to you.
Well, so it's a complicated answer because it's really hard to change behavior, but it's also, I think it's important to realize where we put insulin in the algorithm. So as I pointed out, we put it later, but this might make it earlier, but not as early as pre-diabetes, right? So we have a bunch of drugs now that are very effective earlier, and we would need to look, and I think that that's where CGM comes in. When you think you've got someone even at a good A1C, it may be that they're still high at various times in the day. And I think that if this turns out to meet the potential that I believe it can in terms of helping reduce or add insulin without causing hypoglycemia and weight gain, it does put it earlier, but not as early as pre-diabetes. I'm always against a wall when it really comes to what do I do when somebody needs more insulin? And as I pointed out, the notion of an injection becomes problematic. Especially if I have an older patient, it's like, I just don't want to do it. I don't want them to have to take that insulin shot. I mean, I'm kind of a wuss, but I'm also everybody's mother. And I really want to not have to use it. So I think that this would be a tool that would be used not for prediabetes, not at the very beginning, but somewhere early in the paradigm, particularly, as I said, as we see more and more data that comes from the continuous monitors to show where we're lacking in insulin use. But, I think that prediabetes is much more a condition where weight loss exercise, and that is the approach for our patient management.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And then just my last question is just, can you maybe just talk a little bit about what are the differences maybe from a pathophysiology standpoint when we're looking at type 1 diabetics and using those patients? Just kind of what's going to be different there? That where you see it work in type 2 diabetics, we can't just assume and draw a line that we should see strong activity there as well in the type 1s.
Well, but this is, you see, you're asking really good questions, and I could spend a couple hours with you, really. But the deal is that there's childhood onset, or let's just point out that type 1 diabetes means you have an autoimmune disease that destroys your beta cells. So it's not an insulin resistance plus an insulin deficiency state, it is insulin deficiency. But that's sort of a lie, because as everybody gets older, you develop increasing insulin resistance. You're more sedentary, you lose lean body mass, you gain weight. And so we're seeing a lot of people who have what we call double diabetes, meaning they have both metabolic syndrome and insulin deficiency. But then we now know that half of the new onset type 1s are actually happening in adulthood, and that their type 1, people falsely called LADA, or latent autoimmune diabetes of the adult. But if you have autoimmunity destroying your beta cells, that is type 1. But that may look a lot like type 2 in adult for a really long time. And so I personally see all the oddballs, right? I'm a subspecialist. And I get all these people where they have this very slowly evolving adult onset type 1. And in those people, I would love to use oral insulin because they don't need a complicated insulin regimen with pumps and blah, blah, blah. they need insulin, and they actually need insulin replacement more than perhaps somebody with classic type 2. So one's an autoimmune disease, that's type 1. One's another process where it's much more complicated, which is type 2, insulin resistance and insulin deficiency. But I think there are a lot of people with this slower evolving type 1 as adults where oral insulin would work. I mean, that's something the company would have to look at. But even in the guidelines, now, when we wrote the first ever, I was the co-chair of the International Writing Committee for the first ever guidelines for the management of type 1 diabetes. We put those adult onset type 1s who aren't clearly completely insulin deficient in an indeterminate category. And we recommend treating them as you would treat a type 2 clinically. So I think that there's a lot more utility here than even meets the eye. But the type 1 group is a smaller group. That's, not the one where we're going to use this in huge numbers. But it's clearly an area in which I clinically would use oral insulin. But, I need to get my hands on it. That's why I need this stuff to come to market, because then I'll start playing with it. And, I label off, label on, label, we clinicians can do anything. So I would definitely love to see it used in those patients.
And this is such an important question, because I think there is going to be utility for type 1 patients, and the company is committed to doing a trial in type 1 diabetes. I doubt that it will replace injected insulin. That's very unlikely, because you need larger doses of mealtime insulin. But what it can do is help to insulinize the liver. And this can be part of reducing the overall risk of hypoglycemia in type 1 patients. So I think that there could be value, but as Ann said, we'll have to find the data to prove that.
Thank you both so much.
Good questions.
Thank you for the questions, Edward. Our next question comes from Muz Salim from H.C. Wainwright. Muz, you may go ahead and unmute your line.
Hello, this is Maz on behalf of Ram at H.C. Wainwright. So firstly, what would you say is the most compelling evidence, Dr. Peters, in your view, underpinning the therapeutic relevance of achieving appropriate nighttime glucose control?
Well, again, a very good question with very long answers. So first of all, I think that we don't even understand the impact of hyperglycemia at night on the human psyche. And I think that people at night, and we're starting to do all sorts of sleep studies in people at night with hyperglycemia, because if you think about it, it's just not normal to have a blood sugar of 200 overnight. And I think that it probably affects mood and performance and every other thing that we haven't actually been looking at the next day. And I also have patients recently who've really clearly shown me that at night, and again, this is because we have continuous glucose monitors, when they're having, they correlate bad days with bad nights. And if you take a person with diabetes and you make their nights flat, it makes, first of all, and again, I think this is conjecture, but I think if we studied it, it would show that there was a lot of patient-reported outcomes that would improve. But if you make your nights flat and you start out your day at 100, that's a world of difference than starting out your day at 150 or 200. And so your day becomes, normal. And then you have the postprandial excursions, but it's much easier to manage because you're not chasing to get your blood sugar down first thing in the morning. And in all of us, early in the morning, starting when we wake up, insulin resistance increases. And so people, even if they don't eat, will see an increase in their glucose levels. And again, starting normal and having a basal insulin and oral insulins working at the level of your liver to reduce hepatic glucose production is going to make that whole morning problem less. Does that mean you should eat cereal for breakfast? No, but it does mean that it's going to start you out better.
And just to add on, the anchor dose that we are depending on is the nighttime dose to do just what Ann is saying, to get people a good start the next day. And you might say, well, don't you worry about hypoglycemia during the night? And yes, I do when it's injected insulin that you give at night. We do give basal insulin or long-acting insulin at night, but there still can be problems, even with the slow profile of the basal insulin that's used at night. And so here again, we would expect that some people might benefit from an added dose in the morning, but the key dose will be at night for just the reasons Anne was saying.
Very illuminating, thank you. And how are you viewing the clinical proof of concept data generated with ORMD 0801, particularly with respect to the impact achieved on top of multiple other anti-diabetic medications?
How are we? I'm not sure I quite understood the question. If you could try me again.
We wanted to get your view on the clinical proof of concept data generated so far with respect to the impact achieved whilst taking it on top of other medications.
Right. Well, it's a good story. What we see is that in people who have somewhat more advanced diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and need to be on multiple other oral glucose lowering therapies, that we see a highly meaningful clinical effect on the order of 1 hemoglobin A1C unit. That's quite impressive. And I think it just suggests that we're going to be able to be used with success in patients who are not getting good control on multiple other oral therapies. And I expect that we'll see good measure of effect in people who are on just metformin or no therapy at all.
Okay, great. And in terms of...
Oh, can I say that first of all, the sole reason I'm on this call is because I liked the initial data that I've seen. So I'm volunteering my time to talk to you all. And I really think that there is a good story here. As the clinician, I wait till I have it in my hands to really tell you the answer, but I'm very much inspired or encouraged by the initial data that I've seen. And obviously I'm awaiting the phase 3 trial data, but good control begets good control. So the more you get the blood sugars down over time, the better it gets. And I think that, you know, people's behavior is so important in all of this. And if people are successful, then I think it changes a lot of variables in their lives. So I think this has a lot of potential, but we'll have to see the phase 3 trials.
Appreciate the opinion. And just to touch on safety, might patients in the long run experience better outcomes and fewer side effects by relying on this drug rather than various other medications? And how important do you consider the oral convenience factor to be when evaluating the value proposition?
Huge if it's an easy oral. So remember, we have semaglutide as an oral agent, and you actually have to take that in such a complicated way in the morning and blah, 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 blah. And that's one of the few oral agents where I find it so much easier to give a once a week injection. But in general, it's much better to have an oral agent. But, you know, everything's based on the patient. And in my world, I always give choices. And I would argue that almost all of my patients would prefer a once a day oral than taking any kind of injected therapy. And this is particularly true for my under-resourced patients. And I know they may not be the first users of this, but in terms of getting my patients who are, you know, doing manual labor and doing all sorts of things, their lives are even more impacted by insulin because of the risk of hypoglycemia. So I think this has broad applicability across multiple populations. So I think it would be much better. And finally, like I said, providers, many of them don't have educators in their office to teach how to give a shot, and they think it's hard to do. I could show you right now, and every one of you could learn how to give a shot, but you still might not want to do it.
Okay, thanks. And just finally, just to address the utility beyond type 2 diabetes, is there potential applicability in the treatment of metabolic syndrome or metabesity or any potential in other liver conditions, such as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or the NASH variant? Thanks for taking our questions.
It's a great question. And as Ann said, it's not clear that insulin should be used so early in the pathogenesis of diabetes. But it's quite clear that insulin deficiency starts to develop prior to even diagnosis. And so there is the potential that it could be used earlier than even having diagnosed type 2 diabetes. But that is a ways off in evaluating that potential. And thanks for using the word metabesity, a term I like to use.
Very welcome. Thanks for taking our questions.
Thanks for the questions, Muzz. This concludes the verbal portion of our question and answer session. I'll now turn it over to Eric Goldstein from LifeSci Advisors to read any questions that came over the webcast. Go ahead, Eric.
Thank you, Tara. We have a question for Dr. Fleming. You alluded to the lack of a traditional dose response curve in the clinical studies for the oral insulin candidate in phase 2B. Can you elaborate on that phenomena?
Yeah, it seems surprising that you would not see a linear dose response the way you do with injected insulin. We don't know for sure exactly why this doesn't occur, but it's actually good news that you don't need very large doses to move the needle. What we were able to do over the phase 2 program is come down to lower and lower levels of insulin, which obviously has the advantage of reducing the cost of the product. And what we find is that the 8 milligram dose at bedtime seems to do as well or better than any of the other doses. And that again is surprising. I think it could be explained by the difference between how insulin is secreted from the pancreas and how insulin is transported from the GI tract after absorption from the capsule containing the insulin. In the case of physiologic insulin injection, there's actually a frequency, a pulsatile secretion of insulin. And this may be important, and it's not something that can be simulated by the oral route of delivery, by the transport from the GI tract through the portal blood. It also could be related to the way because of some subtle difference in the way the liver sees the insulin from the absorbed product, that there is a kind of desensitization that occurs. That is, the higher doses start to, for whatever reason, turn down the exposed receptors at the cell surface. So I don't have a definitive answer. We've got a number of theories that remain to be investigated, but I think it will come down to some difference between how the liver sees the insulin that is absorbed from the GI tract.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fleming. Dr. Peters, you had addressed this a couple times in your presentation, but can you just summarize, if approved, who do you think would be the best candidates for an oral insulin product? And ideally, assuming tolerability, where would you start these patients, and how would you use it in place of or with injectable insulin, whether or not that person's taking shots or on a pump?
Well, I'll go to the extreme. So if someone's on a pump, if anyone's on a therapy and they're doing well, I'm wildly unlikely to change it. But this does get driven by patient preference. But if somebody's on an insulin pump, they need both prandial and basal insulin, and they're not going to be put on this. But anybody where I'm thinking of a transition, if they need insulin or if they're on basal insulin already and they want to go to this, then I would certainly consider it. Now, what I don't know, in all honesty, is does it mean if somebody's on 40 units of injected insulin, is this going to take away that injected insulin need, or is it going to be 20 units? And we probably will look at it at units per kilogram per day, but I want to get a sense of how much is needed. Now, I'm going to tell you something out of school, but it's okay. So my husband has type 2 diabetes, and he's a pain in the ass, and he loves candy more than life itself, and he hates to exercise. This would be why he has type 2 diabetes. And he's actually, I've gotten him to lose weight. He's on a GLP-1 receptor agonist. He's on Jardiance. He can only tolerate 500 milligrams of metformin because he's a pain. And he takes Ozempic once a week, which, by the way, I give him because he refuses to give himself an injection. It's a bit of a prima donna, but then again, he's a famous screenwriter, so he's allowed. Now, he needs insulin. And honestly, he needs insulin, but I can't do it. And I can't give him a shot because it would upset him way too much. And he doesn't want to take a shot every day. And it's just really hard. And it's not that he's in terrible control, but I'd like him in better control. And yet I don't want to put him on a sulfonylurea agent because that'll be hypoglycemia and weight gain and blah, blah, blah. And he's tried everything else and he's been on Actos and he has osteoporosis, but this is what he needs. So if this drug came on the market, he might be my first guinea pig. And this would really help him because I need to get him flat overnight so that we can start out the day at least reasonably, and I can oversee breakfast and we can do okay. But he's exactly the person who needs this, is that he needs to be on some exogenous insulin, but he isn't going to be willing to do shots, even though I could give them to him. So I think, and also because I know it sounds weird, but I don't actually like risking hypoglycemia in someone I love. Don't ever say this out loud. This is private, okay? But if, it's just, I can't do it. So anyway, that's just me, that's full confession, but he's the perfect person for this. So there are a lot of people just like him. And it means to me that I'll get them from, an A1C in the high 7s down to the low 7s or even high 6s. And that's huge. That's huge if you look at the UKPDS study, if you look at all the clinical trials, improving your A1C by the percent that this will improve A1C, I believe, is going to make a clinical difference in complications. And if you see people with painful diabetic peripheral neuropathy, if you see my patients who are getting intravitreal injections into their eyes every month, if you see patients who are, really struggling to keep from dialysis, you understand the devastation of this disease that is related to glycemia. So, sorry, that's my speech.
All right, thank you. Here's an interesting question. Is the unmet medical needs similar in the US and ex-US?
Yes. I think that this is true around the world, and it may be actually more true in other places where people are less obese. So I think this is clearly something that is going to be useful around the world.
Right. And the company is going to be getting European data in the phase 3 program. So we're committed to making this a globally available product.
Great, thank you. So this concludes the Q&A session. I will now turn it over to Nadav for closing comments. Thank you.
Eric, firstly, I really want to thank everyone. It was just fascinating to see it and to hear you. So Dr. Peters and Dr. Fleming, thank you very much. Thank you everyone who participated. And I just want to wrap up from where we started in the beginning. So this oral insulin, we're going to have a readout hopefully by the end of the year. And then we want to take it commercially and to start marketing. We already know we have a first patient ready. So we just have to get it approved and to head into the market. So again, thank you everyone. Thank you, Michael Rabinowitz, for helping putting it together. And hopefully we'll see you in healthy and in good times. Thank you very much.